Snow fell thick and silent over the English countryside, muting the world beneath a soft white blanket. At the crest of a long gravel drive stood Hawthorne Lodge, its windows glowing gold against the December frost, wreaths of evergreen and holly decorating its tall oak doors. Inside, the atmosphere radiated warmth, laughter, champagne, and the hum of string music drifting from the drawing room. It was Christmas Eve, and the Mandeville family had gathered for what was meant to be their most elegant holiday celebration in years. But at precisely 9:17 p.m., the merriment fractured. A sharp, metallic clang rang out from the library, like the falling of a fire poker, and moments later a scream tore down the hallway, strangled, breathless, and unmistakably terrified. By the time the guests reached the room, Charles Mandeville, the wealthy patriarch and owner of Hawthorne Lodge, lay slumped beside the marble fireplace. He was alive, barely, but disoriented, clutching at his chest as though reaching for something that had already slipped away. His eyes darted wildly at the faces surrounding him, almost pleading as if he feared them all. On the rich Persian rug beside him lay an overturned silver candelabrum and a small, crumpled piece of parchment. Its edges were singed, and on it were written just 5 words in a hand no one recognized. "The answer lies with you." Within 10 minutes, Charles Mandeville was dead. The household froze in a stunned, brittle silence. Outside, snow continued to fall, as indifferent to tragedy as ever. Inspector Briggs, summoned from the nearby village, took charge with gruff efficiency. He was a square-jawed man with stiff mustaches and a perpetual air of irritated suspicion. "A heart attack, clear as day," he declared after a brief examination. He was 68, and the stress of running this estate would wear down a younger man. This note. He picked up the parchment with 2 fingers. Some sort of holiday prank, no doubt. But the guests whispered, restless and unconvinced. Something in the air felt wrong, stretched too tightly, too deliberately, especially to Madeleine Mandeville, Charles's niece and the one who had found him. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the parchment, its cryptic message gnawing at her thoughts. "This wasn't a heart attack," she murmured. "Uncle Charles knew something, and he was afraid." "Afraid?" Briggs scoffed. "Of what? His own guests?" She did not answer, but her gaze hovered meaningfully over the assembled group. There were 8 of them present that evening. Madeleine Mandeville, the sharp-witted niece with a cool composure that sometimes unnerved even her friends. Edgar Mandeville, Charles's estranged older brother, whose sudden arrival that afternoon had surprised everyone. Beatrice Mandeville, Edgar's wife, elegant and brittle, with eyes that seemed always on the verge of tears or hysteria. Julian Harwood, Charles's personal solicitor, whose loyalty was unquestioned, or so everyone had believed. Vivian Clark, the glamorous widow who had developed a suspiciously close friendship with Charles in recent months. Captain Lionel Fair, a decorated officer and longtime family friend, known equally for his charm and debts. Miss Edith Rowe, the housekeeper, discreet and dutiful, but visibly shaken by the night's events. Thomas Reed, the quiet but observant valet who knew more about the household than anyone realized. They formed a perfect tableau of Christian tension, polished faces, guarded emotions, and beneath it all, secrets thrumming like underground wires. "We should send for a proper detective," Madeleine said firmly. Inspector Briggs bristled. "I assure you, Miss Mandeville, Not from the village," she interrupted quietly. "From London." "London?" Briggs frowned, then narrowed his eyes. "You don't mean—" "I do." Madeleine inhaled sharply. "Tonight of all nights, if there is the slightest chance this was not natural, then we need the one man who does not miss such chances." She paused, almost ceremonially, before speaking the name. "Hercule Poirot." At that very hour, Hercule Poirot sat in a luxurious armchair at his London flat, wearing a robe of the softest grey silk, his egg-shaped head glowing warmly in the lamplight. Before him was a small, perfectly symmetrical supper, a quail egg, a slice of delicately toasted brioche, and a pot of mint tea arranged with the precision of an artist. He had intended a quiet evening of reflection on the year past, on the curious tendencies of human nature, and on the pleasure of symmetry in all things. Then the telephone rang. "Poirot speaking," he said crisply. A trembling voice answered. "Monsieur Poirot, please forgive the hour. My name is Madeleine Mandeville. My uncle has just died under strange circumstances. The inspector believes it was natural, but I do not. There was a note, cryptic, unsettling. I fear something terrible is happening at Hawthorne Lodge." Poirot set down his teacup, his dark eyes sharpening with interest. "And you wish for the assistance of Hercule Poirot," he said softly. "Not a question, merely a statement of fact." "Yes," Madeleine whispered. "Before anything else happens." Poirot glanced at the immaculate order of his supper, then at the small overnight case resting by the door, a habit he had developed over decades of unpredictable summons. "Very well," he said, rising with a deliberate grace. "Poirot will come." For in the voice of Madeleine Mandeville, he had heard something unmistakable. Not merely fear, but the beginning of a puzzle. And Hercule Poirot, the master of puzzles, never ignored such a call. The snow had only deepened by the time Hercule Poirot's hired motor car turned onto the long, torch-lit drive of Hawthorne Lodge. The world seemed draped in silence, the kind that blankets old estates in mystery and expectation. The headlights cut through the swirling flakes, illuminating the grand facade of the manor. Wreaths adorning the windows, candles flickering behind frosted panes, and the warm glow of Christmas Eve festivities dimmed now by tragedy. Poirot stepped out, his polished shoes crunching in the fresh snow. He buttoned the top of his immaculate overcoat, adjusted his gloves, and surveyed the estate with a critical eye. Something in the air felt tense, thick with secrets, with unresolved emotions echoing through the halls. A young butler opened the door. "Monsieur Poirot, Miss Mandeville is expecting you." "And I, mon ami, am expecting her," Poirot replied gently, following him into the corridor. Inside, the atmosphere struck him immediately. Christmas decorations hung with meticulous care, but the room felt disordered, not physically, but emotionally. People spoke in hushed tones, eyes flitted, a shadow clung to every corner. And at the center of the drawing room stood Madeleine Mandeville, poised with a grace that seemed too fragile for the night's events. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming." Her voice trembled only slightly. Poirot bowed. "It is my duty, mademoiselle. When one speaks of a death that is curious, Poirot listens." Inspector Briggs, who had been standing with a stiff posture near the window, bristled at Poirot's arrival. "I must say," Briggs muttered, "I wasn't expecting foreign interference." Poirot smiled mildly. "Ah, but I am not interference, Inspector. I am, how do you say, assistance." Briggs grunted something unintelligible, but Madeleine stepped between them. "Please, both of you, this is not a moment for pride. My uncle is dead, and the note found beside him—" Poirot held up a gloved hand. "Patience, mademoiselle. Poirot must first observe the scene." "Oui?" Madeleine nodded. The library was dim, illuminated only by the soft flicker of the fire and a single lamp. The smell of extinguished candles hung faintly in the air. Poirot's gaze swept the room, slow, methodical, absorbing every detail. The overturned silver candelabrum, the rug with faint smudges where a struggle might or might not have occurred, the marble fireplace with a scattering of ash out of place, and the spot where Charles Mandeville had fallen. Poirot knelt, not touching, merely observing, "The note," Poirot murmured. "Where is it now?" Madeleine handed it to him carefully, encased in a thin evidence sleeve. He read it slowly. "The answer lies with you." Poirot studied the handwriting with visible concentration. "Tell me," he said at last, "did your uncle have enemies?" Madeleine hesitated. "Not enemies, but concerns. He had been troubled these last weeks. Distracted. Something weighed on him." Poirot nodded slightly. "And tonight, on Christmas Eve, surrounded by family and friends, he dies with a message implying accusation." Madeleine's throat tightened. "Yes." Poirot turned slowly toward her. "Then, mademoiselle, we must discover, does it mean one person, or does it mean all?" By the time Poirot and Madeleine returned to the drawing room, the 8 guests stood assembled, some anxious, others irritated, a few already defensive. Poirot surveyed them with quiet interest. Edgar Mandeville, the estranged brother, stood stiffly near the mantelpiece. His face bore the half-scowl of a man with long-harbored resentment. His wife, Beatrice, clutched her shawl tightly around her, her eyes wide and frightened. She avoided everyone's gaze, especially her husband's. Julian Harwood, the solicitor, paced slowly near the bookshelves, hands clasped behind his back in a gesture of forced calm. Vivian Clark lounged with practiced elegance, though her fingers tapped restlessly on the arm of her chair. Captain Lionel Fair, tall and charismatic, wore an uneasy smile. His eyes darted, a little too often, toward the sideboard where the brandy decanter rested. Near the door stood Miss Edith Rowe, the housekeeper, wringing her hands softly, and Thomas Reed, the valet, whose expression betrayed nothing. Poirot folded his hands. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I am Hercule Poirot. I have come because the circumstances of Monsieur Charles Mandeville's death are, at the very least, unusual. I intend to ask questions, not to accuse, but to illuminate." "Oh, very poetic," Captain Fair muttered. Poirot turned an eyebrow toward him. "Yes, Captain, and very necessary." The captain shifted uncomfortably. Poirot continued, "Before I commence the formal interviews, I would like each of you to tell me, in simple fashion, where you were at the time of the incident. It is Christmas Eve, yes, but even Christmas Eve can be a time of truth." Silence reverberated before the first voice spoke. Julian Harwood stepped forward first. "I was in the conservatory, reviewing some documents Mr. Mandeville had asked me to bring. When the scream came, I was among the first to arrive." Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. "Documents for business on Christmas Eve?" Harwood stiffened. It was urgent. Poirot nodded but filed it away. Vivian Clark spoke next. "I was in the music room," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Your captain friend," she gestured to Lionel, "was trying to persuade me to sing." Captain Fair gave a sheepish shrug. "A Christmas carol. Purely harmless." Poirot responded with a single, knowing, "Oui." Edgar Mandeville cleared his throat. "Beatrice and I were in the west corridor. He paused. "Talking." Beatrice's eyes dropped to the floor. Poirot made no reaction. Yet. Miss Edith Rowe, the housekeeper, said softly, "I was preparing the guest rooms. Mr. Mandeville had requested we be ready for visitors. Staying overnight." Poirot tilted his head. "Visitors. Unexpected." "Yes," she whispered. And finally, Thomas Reed, the valet, spoke. "I was polishing the silver in the pantry. I saw no one. Not a single account aligned. Not a single person had a witness to confirm their claim." Poirot smiled faintly. "A most interesting Christmas Eve," he said, "and one with a puzzle at its heart." As the group dispersed, some with relief, others with annoyance, Poirot remained still, lost in thought. Something was wrong, not just the note, not just the disorder of the library, but the atmosphere, charged, brittle, like a violin string pulled too tight. Poirot tapped a finger lightly against his sleeve. "There is more to this," he murmured to himself. "Much more." For among the 8 people gathered at Hawthorne Lodge, he sensed guilt, fear, resentment, and something else. Something quiet, hidden, and deadly. As the clock chimed 11, Hercule Poirot knew one thing with certainty. This was no natural death, and Christmas Eve at Hawthorne Lodge was only beginning. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, each resonant note echoing through Hawthorne Lodge like a ceremonial toll. Christmas Day had arrived, but without joy, without warmth. The festive garlands and candlelit windows now felt like grim witnesses to a night wrapped in secrets. Inspector Briggs had retired to a corner with a mug of strong tea, muttering about foreign detectives making simple matters complicated. The guests drifted uneasily, scattered across the drawing room and hall, avoiding one another's eyes. Poirot, however, was in his element. With Madeleine at his side, notebook in hand, though seldom used, he prepared to begin the formal interviews. The small morning room, cozy, warm, and intimate, served as his temporary office. The fire crackled, and the snow outside muffled all sound. "Let us commence," Poirot said, settling himself in an armchair with symmetrical cushions. "We will speak one at a time in private. Mademoiselle Madeleine, would you be so good as to invite Monsieur Harwood first?" Madeleine nodded and departed. Poirot adjusted his moustache with a small, precise gesture. "The solicitor," he murmured. "Often, the lawyer knows too much or too little. Either case is interesting." Julian Harwood entered with the stiff posture of a man accustomed to formality. He removed his gloves, placed them neatly on the table, and sat with the studied calm of someone determined to appear blameless. Poirot studied him for several seconds before speaking. "Monsieur Harwood, you were summoned here tonight by Monsieur Charles Mandeville himself, oui?" "Yes," Harwood said. "He asked me to bring a set of documents for him." Poirot tilted his head. "Documents of importance or documents of sentiment?" Harwood hesitated. "Importance, certainly, though he did not tell me why the urgency." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "you traveled here on Christmas Eve during a storm to satisfy this urgency." Harwood's lips tightened. "Mr. Mandeville was a client of long standing. When he requested something, I complied." "Ah," Poirot said lightly. "And did you give him the documents?" "That is the curious part." Harwood shifted uneasily. "He never asked for them again after I arrived. We spoke briefly earlier in the evening, and then he seemed distracted, as though preoccupied with something else." "Something or someone?" Poirot asked. Before Harwood could respond, Poirot continued, "And these documents, what do they concern?" Harwood hesitated longer this time. "His will." Poirot's eyes glinted. "His will? Revised or original?" "A revised version," Harwood answered reluctantly. "One he wished to sign before the new year." Poirot placed his fingertips together. "And did anyone else know of this revision?" "I do not believe so." Poirot leaned back, satisfied for now. "Merci, Monsieur Harwood. You may return to the others." Harwood collected his gloves with trembling fingers. Poirot watched him leave. "A will revised on Christmas Eve," he murmured. "The timing, the secrecy, it is most instructive." When Vivienne Clark entered, she brought with her the unmistakable air of perfume, elegance, and carefully curated charm. She sat with practiced poise, offering Poirot a soft, warm smile. "Such a terrible tragedy, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Charles was dear to me." Poirot nodded. "You were close?" She lifted her chin. "I will not deny it. We understood each other." "And did Monsieur Mandeville invite you tonight, or did you arrive of your own choosing?" "He invited me," she said quickly, "as he has done these last several months. He appreciated my company. Poirot studied her face. Her eyes were steady, her voice calm, but her hands, folded in her lap, twitched almost imperceptibly. "Tell me, madame," Poirot asked gently, "what was the nature of your last conversation with Monsieur Mondeville?" Vivienne's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. He seemed worried, more so than usual. "But he wouldn't tell me what about." "Did it concern money?" Poirot asked. She flinched. "Why would you ask that?" "A simple question." Vivienne swallowed. "No, at least he never discussed finances with me in detail." Poirot offered a polite smile. "You understand, madame, that every relationship, professional or personal, has layers. Some layers are honest, others are convenient." Her face reddened slightly. "Are you suggesting—" Poirot raised a hand. "I suggest nothing. I only observe." She exhaled sharply. "I cared for Charles. Deeply. And whoever frightened him, whoever caused this—" Her voice cracked. "I hope you find them, monsieur. Poirot." Poirot bowed his head. "Merci. You may go." As she exited, Poirot whispered, "Her fear. It is real. But for whom?" Captain Lionel Fair entered with a swagger that poorly concealed his nervousness. His uniform coat was unbuttoned, his collar askew, as though he had dressed in haste. "Poirot," he said with an unconvincing smile, "I hear you're here to complicate things." Poirot returned a polite stare. "Only to illuminate, Captain. Now, your relationship with Monsieur Mondeville." "We were friends," Lionel said too quickly. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Were you? Or were you indebted to him?" Lionel's smile vanished. "What makes you think that?" Poirot tapped his chin. "One observes the small things, the manner in which you glance at the sideboard, the way you speak of your friend with the tone of obligation, not affection." Lionel leaned forward, tense. "Charles lent me money, yes. A temporary loan." "How temporary?" "Longer than I'd intended." Poirot's voice softened. "Debt is a heavy chain, monsieur. Did Monsieur Mondeville threaten to call in this loan?" Lionel hesitated. "He said he wanted to speak with me tonight. Privately. Something about putting his affairs in order." "That's all?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Merci. You may rejoin the others." Lionel stood, visibly rattled. Poirot watched him leave, a thoughtful frown forming. "Money, wills, secrets," Poirot murmured. "A pattern begins to form." Poirot had requested they come together. Edgar entered stiffly, Beatrice following like a ghost, haunting his shadow. They sat opposite Poirot, their marriage tension hanging like smoke in the air. Poirot began gently. "Monsieur Mondeville, you said earlier that you were talking with your wife at the time of the incident." Edgar's jaw tightened. "Yes." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. Poirot turned to her. "Madame, would you describe this conversation?" Beatrice stared at her hands. "It was unpleasant." Edgar snapped, "There's no need to." Poirot silenced him with a single finger raised. Beatrice whispered, "Charles told Edgar he intended to change the will. My husband did not take it well." Edgar stood abruptly. "That is enough." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Sit, monsieur." Edgar froze, then sat. Poirot continued gently. "This new will, did your brother tell you its contents?" "No," Edgar said bitterly. "But I can guess. Madeleine would inherit the estate. Not me. Not after our disagreements." Poirot nodded slowly. "And did you discuss this with your brother tonight?" Edgar's jaw clenched. "Briefly. He said we would speak after supper." "And now," Poirot said softly, "he's dead." Silence. Beatrice began to cry. Poirot dismissed them gently. When they were gone, Poirot whispered, "A family divided. A fortune at stake. Secret will. It is an old story, but deadly." By the time the final interview ended, The fire had burned low and the house had grown eerily quiet. Poirot sat alone in the armchair, fingertips pressed together. "Someone lies," he murmured. Not once. Several times. He closed his eyes. And yet, none of them lie well. But one detail, one tiny, easily overlooked detail, had already struck him as profoundly wrong. A detail he would not share. Not yet, for in the art of detection, timing is everything, and Hercule Poirot was only beginning. By dawn, Hawthorne Lodge had settled into a heavy, sleepless quiet. The snow outside lay undisturbed except for the faint tracks of Poirot's arrival the night before. Inside, the halls seemed to hold their breath, as though the house itself sensed the tangle of deception that had begun to unfurl beneath its roof. Poirot descended the grand staircase, immaculate as ever. Not a hair was out of place, not a speck of dust clung to his coat. He walked with controlled, rhythmic steps, measured, deliberate, the pace of a mind always several moves ahead. Madeleine met him in the hall, her face pale with fatigue. "Good morning, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. "Bon matin, mademoiselle." Poirot offered a sympathetic nod. "A difficult night, yes? But today we begin in earnest." "Inspector Briggs believes he already has a lead," she said anxiously. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, and what is this lead, as the good inspector calls it?" Madeleine gestured toward the library. "He found something this morning, something he believes is incriminating." Poirot followed her, his expression unreadable. Briggs stood triumphantly by the desk, holding a sealed envelope with tongs, as though it were a venomous snake. "Poirot," he said, his voice thick with self-importance, "I believe I found our culprit." Poirot gave a polite nod. "Then by all means, Inspector, enlighten us." Briggs puffed out his chest. "This envelope was hidden in the library desk, addressed to Mr. Julian Harwood, and inside—" He carefully slid out the contents, a bank statement showing a series of large, unaccounted withdrawals from Charles Mandeville's private account. Madeleine inhaled sharply. Uncle Charles had been withdrawing money? Why? Briggs smirked. The better question is, why was Harwood's name on it? Poirot took the statement delicately between two gloved fingers, studying the figures. "Interesting," he murmured. Briggs leaned in. "You know how these things go. Businessmen, solicitors, access to accounts. Looks like Harwood's been dipping into funds." "Or perhaps," Poirot said softly, "someone wishes us to believe so." Briggs scowled. "Oh, come now. It's plain as day. Harwood had motive, financial motive. Maybe Charles confronted him last night. Things turned sour. They fought. The old man collapsed. Simple." "Simple," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. Madeleine shook her head. "Julian would never steal. He's been with us for years." Briggs turned on her. "People change when money's involved, Miss Mandeville. Trust me, I've seen it more times than I can count." Poirot held up a hand. "Inspector, may I ask, how did you discover this envelope?" "Routine search," Briggs said proudly. "Technically beyond procedure, perhaps. But these things require initiative." Poirot's eyes glinted. "Ah, initiative." He returned the paper to Briggs. "Very well, Inspector. Let us speak with Monsieur Harwood." Julian Harwood entered, looking weary but composed. His hands trembled as he buttoned his coat against the cold draft in the library. "You wish to see me?" he asked Poirot cautiously. Briggs pounced like a wolf on prey. "Mr. Harwood, care to explain why Charles Mandeville's bank account shows large, mysterious withdrawals over the last 2 months? Withdrawals connected to you?" Harwood blanched. "What? No, that's impossible. I've never—" Briggs thrust the statement toward him. "Recognize it." Harwood examined it, his face draining of color. This is not my doing. I had no knowledge of these transactions." Poirot watched him with calm scrutiny. Then, monsieur, Poirot said quietly, perhaps you can explain why this envelope, addressed to you, was hidden in the library desk? Harwood opened his mouth, closed it, then spoke with difficulty. I can't. I have no idea how it got there. Briggs folded his arms. A likely story. Poirot's voice was gentle. Monsieur Harwood, were you in any financial difficulty? Harwood hesitated, but only briefly. Minor, but nothing requiring theft. Poirot leaned back. You deny altering the account? Absolutely, Harwood said fiercely, and Charles would have known immediately if something was amiss. Poirot studied him a moment, then sighed. Merci, Monsieur Harwood. You may go, but remain accessible. Harwood left in a dazed state. Briggs turned triumphantly to Poirot. Clear as daylight, he's lying through his teeth. Poirot said nothing. Instead, he walked quietly to the desk. He surveyed it with careful, almost spiritual reverence. Then he pointed lightly to a thin line of dust. Inspector, Poirot said softly. Notice the dust layer stops abruptly beneath where the envelope was supposedly hidden, yet the rest of the drawer is covered evenly. Briggs blinked. And this envelope, Poirot said, was placed here recently, very recently, by someone who wished it to be found. Briggs' face fell. You mean, yes, Poirot said calmly, a false lead. Madeleine exhaled in relief. Briggs grumbled. Fine. Then Harwood's off the hook. For now. Poirot nodded. Indeed. But someone placed the envelope. Someone who knows the habits of the house and the habits of the inspector. Briggs frowned. My habits? Poirot smiled delicately. You are a man, Inspector, who believes strongly in the obvious. A man who searches desks, drawers, and pockets. A man easy to manipulate. Briggs turned red. Poirot continued, whoever planted this expected the envelope to incriminate Harwood and to distract us. Distract us from what? Madeleine asked anxiously. Poirot tapped his chin. That, mademoiselle, is what we must discover. Poirot returned to the library fireplace. He knelt, studying again the faint scatter of ash on the rug. Ash not consistent with the usual fireplace sweep. Someone burned something last night, he murmured. In haste. Madeleine knelt beside him. Do you think it was connected to the will? Poirot gave a small, non-committal gesture. Possibly. He examined the ashes with a small silver tool from his pocket. A delicate tongue-like instrument. Among the ash lay a tiny scrap of card, barely surviving the flames, but enough to show one unmistakable thing. A torn corner of blue parchment paper, not from the will documents, which were white. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A fragment of something important, he murmured. But someone tried to destroy it. Briggs frowned. And what does that tell you? Poirot rose, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. It tells me, Poirot said softly, that the death of Monsieur Mondeville was no accident. He turned to Madeleine. It tells me he was frightened. Then he turned toward the hole, and it tells me that the murderer, he paused, is clever, very clever. Poirot's voice deepened, but not clever enough to escape Hercule Poirot. The snow outside grew heavier as the morning light softened into a pale, cold glow. Hawthorne Lodge felt strangely suspended in time, a place untouched by the world beyond its frosted windows. Inside, Christmas decorations still shimmered, but every sparkle felt mocking now, a reminder of a celebration interrupted by death. Poirot sat in the morning room once more, sipping a small cup of hot chocolate. The steam curled delicately upward, forming a perfect, symmetrical spiral. He watched it with almost meditative calm. Madeleine entered quietly. Monsieur Poirot, everyone is anxious. They keep asking what you've discovered. Poirot smiled gently. Ah, but discovery is a process, mademoiselle. Only the murderer is in a hurry. She looked pale again, and Poirot softened. "Do not fear. We move closer to the truth." They were interrupted by a sharp knock. Captain Lionel Fair stepped in. "Monsieur Poirot," he said stiffly, "I need to speak with you, privately." Poirot set down his cup. "Then let us speak." Lionel closed the door behind him, pacing with a restless energy that betrayed his nerves. "I should have said something earlier," he muttered. "I didn't think it was relevant, but—" Poirot steepled his fingers. "Perhaps it is now relevant, Captain." Lionel exhaled sharply. "Last night, before dinner, Charles confronted me. He said he wanted the money back. The loan." Poirot nodded slowly. "Money again. Continue." "He said he could no longer justify supporting my financial situation. He said it was time I stood on my own feet." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You were angry?" Lionel hesitated long enough to reveal the answer. "I was surprised, but not angry," Poirot asked, the slightest edge of doubt curling beneath his tone. Lionel looked away. "Anyone would be upset, but I didn't harm him, if that's what you're suggesting." Poirot made no comment. Lionel continued. "After our conversation, I went straight to the music room. Vivienne can confirm that." Poirot tilted his head. "Yes, but Vivienne is not the most reliable witness when her emotions are involved." Lionel scowled. "Are you implying something improper?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Captain, your indignation is most unnecessary. It reveals more than you think." Lionel's expression soured. Poirot rose slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket. "Merci, Captain. You have been informative." Lionel frowned. "But you don't believe me." Poirot paused at the door. "I believe, monsieur, that you are a man who fears his debts more than he fears the truth. And such a man is always interesting." He left Lionel standing alone, pale and sweating. Late morning brought a subdued tension to the west corridor. Poirot, strolling with the air of a man taking in a leisurely promenade, turned a corner, only to hear voices raised in hushed intensity. Edgar and Beatrice Mandeville. Their silhouettes were partially visible through the frosted glass of a side door. Poirot did not intrude, but he listened. "You cannot hide it anymore," Beatrice whispered, voice cracking. "You must tell him." "I will not," Edgar hissed, "and you will not mention it to anyone." "Do you understand?" Beatrice's reply was trembling. "Edgar, this has gone too far. Charles knew. That's why he called us here." Poirot stiffened. Charles knew what? Edgar responded sharply. He suspected, but he had no proof. And now... He broke off abruptly. Poirot, with deliberate footsteps, approached visibly so they would sense his arrival. Edgar straightened immediately, plastering a strained smile on his face. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "just stretching our legs." Poirot bowed politely. "A most healthy habit, though one wonders, Monsieur Edgar, why such stretching requires raised voices." Edgar's smile faltered. We were upset. Grief does strange things." Poirot glanced at Beatrice. Her eyes were filled with a quiet plea. For rescue, for truth, or perhaps for confession. But Poirot stepped back gracefully. "Of course," he said. "Grief makes us say curious things, and sometimes it reveals far more than it hides." Edgar stiffened. Beatrice looked as though she might break. Poirot moved on, but his mind whirred. Near noon, Poirot visited the conservatory. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, casting soft reflections over the indoor ferns and orchids. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and winter blooms. Poirot examined the room where Harwood had claimed to be reviewing documents. A small, glass-topped table dominated the center, but something was wrong. Poirot knelt. On the polished floor tile beneath the table was a tiny glint, almost invisible. Poirot retrieved it with a handkerchief. A jeweled earring, but only one. Poirot whispered, "Curious." He recalled Vivienne Clark's elegant appearance and her earrings from the previous evening. They had matched perfectly. This one did not. It was a different design entirely. Poirot rose, filing this discovery away with deliberate care. Someone had been in the conservatory last night. Someone not accounted for. Someone lying. Poirot returned to his temporary workspace, arranging the facts in his mind. He often said that physical clues were inferior to psychology, but sometimes a clue was as psychological as any word. The note. The answer lies with you. Poirot read it again, holding it delicately between two fingers. Madeleine entered quietly. "Monsieur Poirot, is it true that the note could mean one of us?" Poirot looked up with gentle, grave eyes. "Mademoiselle, the note tells me something very important about the mind of Monsieur Mondeville." "What is that?" Poirot tapped the note lightly. He did not write it in panic. No, he wrote it with intention, with clarity, a message created before he was overcome. Madeleine stepped back in shock. "You mean he knew he was in danger?" Poirot nodded once. "And that is not all. Mademoiselle, do you notice anything odd about this paper?" She frowned. "It's thicker than normal parchment, and it's slightly blue-tinted." Poirot smiled. "Very good. And what else in this house is written on blue parchment?" Her eyes widened. "The Christmas invitations." "Exactly," Poirot said quietly. "This note was torn from one of those invitations?" "Then, the murderer was invited?" Poirot's voice softened. "But more importantly, Charles Mandeville used one himself." Madeleine swallowed. "Why would he do that?" Poirot looked at the note again, his eyes narrowing. "Because," he murmured, "he knew something that frightened him." He tapped the blue scrap from the fireplace, the one nearly burned, a perfect match. And someone tried very hard to destroy what he wrote. That afternoon, Poirot gathered all 8 suspects in the drawing room. The fire crackled warmly, but the tension was ice-cold. Poirot stood before them with the authority of a magistrate and the precision of a surgeon. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "one among you has lied. One has attempted misdirection. One has planted evidence." Nervous glances darted. Poirot continued, "But more importantly, one of you was in the conservatory last night, and one of you tore a blue parchment before trying to burn its remnants." Lionel shifted. Vivienne stiffened. Edgar's jaw clenched. Beatrice trembled. But Poirot's gaze swept over them all like a razor. "I will uncover the truth," Poirot said softly. "But already I see the cracks in your stories." He paused, and it is only a matter of time before the mask slips. The room froze. Poirot bowed. "We shall speak again, one by one." A hush fell over Hawthorne Lodge as the afternoon faded into a cold, unforgiving dusk. The wind outside howled softly, swirling snow against the windows, as though the storm itself wished to bury the truth beneath layers of ice. Poirot sensed the shift immediately. In every case, there came a moment when the murderer, feeling the pressure tighten, made a mistake. A desperate act, a miscalculation, and Poirot, keen-eyed and patient, knew that moment was approaching. He sat before the library fire, warming his hands with calm precision, when Madeleine hurried in, breathless. "Monsieur Poirot, something is terribly wrong." Poirot rose at once. "Show me, mademoiselle." She led him swiftly toward the rear veranda. The glass doors stood slightly ajar, letting in a thin draft of freezing air. Poirot frowned. "You found it like this?" "Yes," Madeleine whispered. "Just minutes ago." Poirot stepped forward and caught sight of something that made his eyes narrow. Bloody footprints, small sharp impressions trailing outward into the snow-covered garden, disappearing into the deepening storm. Poirot crouched, careful not to disturb the prints. "They are fresh," he murmured. "Very fresh." Madeleine shivered. "Whose are they?" Poirot stood, looking toward the garden with grim calm. "That is what we must find out." He called in Inspector Briggs, who rushed in with the eagerness of a man hoping for an easy breakthrough. "What is it now?" Briggs asked, already irritated. Poirot gestured toward the prints. "Someone has left the house, wounded or carrying something, or someone who is." Briggs paled. "Someone fled." Poirot's voice was low. "Or someone was taken." Within 10 minutes, the household was in an uproar, not because of the footprints, not because of the open door, but because one person could not be found. Miss Edith Rowe, the housekeeper. She had vanished. The realization spread like wildfire. Vivian gasped and clutched her pearls. Lionel muttered a curse. Edgar stared, stunned into silence. Beatrice collapsed into a chair, trembling. Thomas Reed looked genuinely shaken, the first real emotion he had displayed. Julian Harwood paced like a trapped animal. Poirot surveyed them all with unreadable calm. "Mademoiselle Rowe," he said softly, "was the one person whose account last night was least verifiable, and now she disappears." Briggs rubbed his temples. "Do you think she killed Charles and ran?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, Inspector." "Running in the snow? Alone? Wounded, perhaps?" "No, this is not the action of a murderer." Briggs scoffed. "You don't know that." Poirot stepped closer, his eyes sharp as steel. "I know that the footprints are too small to be hers." Briggs blinked. "What?" Poirot pointed. "Observe the gait, the spacing, the angle of the foot. These belong to someone lighter, someone who moves differently. Not to Miss Rowe." Briggs crouched awkwardly to examine them, but clearly saw nothing. Poirot continued, "Miss Rowe did not flee. She was taken, or lured." Madeleine whispered, "But why?" Poirot's expression grew grave. "Because she knew something, or saw something, or she possessed something." Poirot insisted they search Miss Rowe's room. It was a modest space, neatly kept, with few personal items. A single photograph of what appeared to be her younger brother stood on the bedside table, but Poirot's eyes were drawn instantly to the wardrobe. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "open it." Briggs did so, grumbling, and froze. Inside hung Miss Rowe's uniform coat, but its left sleeve was torn, and beneath it, on the wooden floor, lay a tiny shard of blue parchment. Poirot stooped to pick it up with delicate fingers. Madeleine gasped. "The same parchment as the note?" Poirot nodded once, and from the same torn edge as the fragment burned in the fireplace. Briggs whistled. "So she wrote the note." Poirot shook his head sharply. "No, Inspector. Use your eyes. This fragment shows no writing at all." Madeleine understood instantly. "Then she possessed a torn invitation. One Charles tore?" Poirot closed his eyes briefly, impressed. "Très bien, mademoiselle." He opened them again, voice low. "Miss Rowe knew something of the note, whether she saw it, handled it, or overheard something about it." Edgar muttered, "This is absurd. Edith is harmless." Beatrice whispered, "But perhaps she saw something last night and was afraid." Poirot nodded. Fear is a powerful motivator. He looked at the empty wardrobe with a somber expression, and someone feared what she might reveal. As the storm strengthened outside, Poirot led the group back toward the veranda. He studied the footprints for a long, silent moment. His gaze tracked their path, across the snow, toward the darkened tree line. Someone had led her out there, someone who believed the storm would conceal their crime. Poirot's face hardened. "The murderer is accelerating," he said softly. Voila, the second crime. Briggs swallowed. You think she's dead? Poirot did not answer directly. Mademoiselle Rowe has met with harm, he said. That is enough for now. Madeleine hugged her arms around herself. But why her? Why not someone else? Poirot turned to her. Because Miss Rowe had the misfortune of witnessing something, or knowing something that threatened the murderer. His voice lowered to a chilling whisper. And when murderers are desperate, they silence the vulnerable first. Madeleine led Poirot back inside, away from the freezing air. She looked shaken, near tears. Who would harm her? She whispered. Poirot paused at the foot of the stairs. Let us examine the lies told last night. Madeleine wiped her eyes. So many lies. Poirot nodded. But one lie stands out above all others. Which one? Poirot said softly. Someone claimed to be in the conservatory at the time of the death. Julian Harwood. Yes, Poirot said. Yet the earring I found there does not belong to him, nor to Vivian Clark. Madeleine shivered. Then whose? Poirot lifted a finger. We shall not leap to conclusions. But note this, mademoiselle. The conservatory is near the back entrance, the same entrance from which Miss Rowe was taken. Madeleine froze. Poirot continued. Someone was moving between the library and the garden last night. Someone whose earrings do not match their stories. A cold horror crept across her face. Poirot leaned closer, his voice a soft razor. And that someone knows I found the earring. Later, as snow beat softly against the windows and the house huddled into fearful silence, Poirot retired to the study. He stared into the fire, mind racing. 2 crimes. 1 note. 1 missing housekeeper. 1 blue parchment. 1 planted envelope. 1 earring. And a web of lies, tightening like a noose. Poirot whispered to himself, someone grows reckless. Someone makes errors. He closed his eyes. And soon, they will make the final error. The storm worsened by evening. Snow lashed against the windows in thick, frantic swirls, and the world beyond Hawthorne Lodge had dissolved into a white, swirling haze. The house itself had grown unbearably still, suffocating under the weight of unanswered questions. Every creak of floorboard, every flicker of the chandelier seemed charged with dread. In the drawing room, Poirot stood at the window, hands clasped neatly behind his back, staring out at the impenetrable darkness. The fire crackled behind him, throwing long shadows across the room. Madeleine sat on the sofa, watching Poirot with a mixture of worry and hope. Monsieur Poirot, she whispered, is Miss Rowe still alive? Poirot did not turn. I do not know, but I hope so. The snow preserves many things, and conceals others. His tone was calm, but there was a steeliness beneath it, an urgency held in perfect restraint. At that moment, the door opened, and Julian Harwood stepped inside. His face was pale, his tie askew, his composure fraying. Poirot, he said with a trembling breath, I must speak with you alone. Poirot turned, studying him carefully. Then speak, Monsieur Harwood. Julian swallowed hard. It's about the will. There's something I didn't tell you. Madeleine stiffened. Poirot raised a hand gently. Remain, mademoiselle. Your presence may be useful. Julian hesitated, but Poirot's authority prevailed. Harwood wrung his hands. Charles asked me not only to bring the new will, but to destroy the old one. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Destroy the old will? Ah, now that is a most curious instruction. Why did he ask this? Julian grimaced. Because the new will was radically different. He intended to leave most of his estate to Madeleine. Madeleine gasped. What? But Uncle Charles never told me. No, Harwood said softly. He wished it to be a surprise. A Christmas gift, he said. Poirot nodded slightly. And what of Edgar? Julian hesitated. He would receive very little. Poirot's eyes glinted. Ah, a motive for anger, resentment, and perhaps violence. Julian continued. Charles feared Edgar would confront him. He asked me to bring the new will secretly so he could sign it before announcing anything. Poirot tapped his chin thoughtfully. And yet, the will remains unsigned. Yes, Julian whispered. Whatever Charles planned, he never had the chance. Poirot watched him closely. Did anyone else know? Julian shook his head. No one, at least not from me. Poirot stepped forward. And yet, monsieur, there are signs that someone did know. Someone besides you, someone with much to lose. Julian looked bewildered. Poirot dismissed him gently. When Julian left, Madeleine turned to Poirot, her face pale. Do you think Edgar learned about the will? Poirot responded quietly. I think Edgar suspects more than he admits, and suspicion is often the seed of desperation. Poirot sought out Beatrice next. He found her alone in the sitting room, trembling as she stared into a cold, unlit fireplace. Madame, Poirot said softly, may I join you? She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. Yes, please. Poirot sat beside her, his expression gentle. You have carried a great fear since last night. Something troubles you deeply. Beatrice's voice cracked. It's Edgar. He has become a different man these last months. Bitter, angry, obsessive. Poirot nodded. About money? She gave a weak laugh. About everything. His business is failing, though he hides it. He drinks too much. He blames Charles for his struggles. Poirot leaned in slightly. And yet, madame, you said something earlier. Something important. You said Charles knew something, and that is why he called you here. Beatrice closed her eyes, shaking. Charles told Edgar he suspected irregularities, that Edgar had been taking money from the family accounts years ago. Long before now, he threatened to expose him. Poirot's eyes sharpened. And Edgar's response? Rage. Beatrice shuddered. I have never seen him so furious. Poirot studied her face. Did you fear for Charles? A tear slipped down her cheek. Yes. Poirot's voice lowered. And did Edgar leave your sight last night? Beatrice inhaled sharply. For a few minutes. Yes. During the time of the attack? She nodded miserably. Poirot placed a comforting hand on hers. Madame, secrets kept from fear are still truths. Her voice broke into a whisper. Poirot, please find Miss Rowe. She was kind to me. She knew things too. Things Edgar wanted forgotten. Poirot nodded solemnly. I will. Poirot located Thomas Reed polishing silver in the pantry, a repetitive, anxious motion that betrayed his distress. You work very diligently, monsieur, Poirot said. Thomas froze. Just keeping busy, sir. Poirot observed him quietly. You are fond of Miss Rowe? Thomas swallowed hard. Yes, sir. She was good, always kind. We were friends. Poirot stepped closer. And did she tell you anything last night? Anything unusual? Thomas hesitated long enough to betray the answer. Poirot pressed gently. Monsieur Reed, if you do not speak now, the murderer may strike again. Thomas trembled. Miss Rowe. She said she saw someone near the conservatory right before the scream. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Poirot's voice remained soft. Who? Thomas's eyes darted to the door as though someone could be listening. She didn't say, he whispered. Only that she would tell Charles after dinner. Poirot's eyes widened subtly. And now she is missing. Thomas nodded miserably. Poirot exhaled. Merci. You have helped more than you know. By evening, Poirot stood once more in the library. The fire burned low, casting flickering light across the floor where Charles had fallen. Poirot stared at the ash pile, the fragments of burned parchment, now cold and lifeless. Madeleine joined him quietly. "Have you learned anything new?" she asked. Poirot lifted the charred scrap of blue parchment. "I have learned, mademoiselle, that someone tore a Christmas invitation, and someone tore a different blue paper, the one Charles wrote his warning on." Madeleine frowned. "But why 2 papers?" Poirot's eyes shone. "Because the murderer replaced the original message with a forged one. They tried to mislead us." She gasped softly. "Then the note we have may not be the message Charles intended at all." Madeleine stepped back, horrified. "But why forge it?" Poirot's answer was quiet, chilling. "To frame someone else, and to conceal a motive more terrible than we yet understand." Poirot stared into the fire once more, his mind assembling the clues like pieces of a delicate clockwork. The forged note, the planted bank envelope, the missing housekeeper, the solitary earring, the torn sleeve, the missing brother's motive, the solicitor's fear, the wife's trembling, the captain's debts, the widow's secrets. Each piece fit a pattern only Poirot could see. And then a flicker of revelation flashed across his face. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered. "Now I see." Madeleine leaned forward. "What do you see?" Poirot turned slowly, his eyes blazing with sudden clarity. A truth so simple, yet so carefully hidden. He stepped toward the hall. "It is time," he said. "Time for the murderer to make their final error." Night descended swiftly, swallowing the house in a deep, snow-muted quiet. Hawthorne Lodge felt like an island surrounded by a white abyss, each gust of wind rattling the windows like the taps of unseen fingers. Poirot stood in the great hall, coat buttoned, scarf neatly arranged, ready to venture into the storm once more. Madeleine watched him with growing dread. "Monsieur Poirot, surely you are not going out there again?" Poirot gave a small, reassuring smile. "But yes, mademoiselle." There is something outside that calls to Poirot, something most important. "But the storm?" Poirot raised a hand gently. "Ah, the storm. It hides things, yes, but it also preserves them." Madeleine shivered, though the hall was warm. "You believe Miss Rowe is still out there?" "I believe, mademoiselle, that we have reached the point in this affair where danger hides not only in the house, but in the snow." He turned toward the back door, but before he could reach it, Vivienne Clark stepped forward from the shadows of the corridor. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, "you cannot go alone." Poirot tilted his head. "You wish to accompany me, madame?" Vivienne hesitated only a second before nodding. "I cannot sit here doing nothing while a woman might be dying out there." Poirot regarded her carefully, noting the tightening of her jaw, the tremble of her fingers. "Courage or desperation?" "Very well," he said. "You may join me." They stepped out into the night. The wind cut through the air like a blade, stinging their cheeks, whipping their coats against them. Poirot held a lantern, its flame flickering violently. Vivienne trudged beside him, arms wrapped tightly around herself as snow clung to her dark hair like frost. The trail of footprints they had found earlier was fading rapidly, nearly erased by new snowfall. Poirot bent low, examining the ground. "See here, madame," he said. The prints turned sharply, away from the garden path. Vivienne squinted. "It looks as though someone dragged something." Poirot gave a grave nod. "Not dragged, supported. There are 2 sets of prints here." He pointed with his cane. "One deep set, leading, one lighter, staggering." Vivienne's breath caught. "Miss Rowe?" "Oui." They continued following the trail toward a cluster of old, frost-covered hedges near the pond. The lantern's glow revealed broken branches, trampled snow, and a faint smear of blood on a low branch. Vivienne brought a hand to her mouth. "Oh, God!" Poirot moved faster, his small steps brisk, purposeful. Then He stopped. His lantern fell upon something half buried in the snow, a fabric, dark grey, torn. Poirot knelt and lifted it carefully. A coat. Miss Rowe's coat. Vivienne sank to her knees, sobbing. Has she... Poirot's voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp as diamonds. Mademoiselle Rowe is not here. Vivienne blinked. But her coat, left deliberately, Poirot said. To mislead us. To suggest she died here. Vivienne stared at him. Then where is she? Poirot stood slowly, lantern lifted. We must search the boathouse. A short walk from the hedges loomed the old wooden boathouse, its roof heavy with snow, its padlock dangling broken from the latch. Vivienne gasped. That wasn't broken yesterday. Indeed, Poirot murmured. He pushed open the door. The lantern light spilled across the interior, revealing dust, cobwebs, and a faint movement. Poirot stepped forward, senses sharpened. Madame Clark, fetch help, quickly. Vivienne ran, her footsteps fading in the snow. Poirot approached the shadowy corner. Miss Edith Rowe lay curled on the floor, bound at the wrists, gagged but conscious. Her eyes widened with relief the moment she saw him. Poirot knelt immediately. Mademoiselle Rowe, you are safe now. She trembled violently as he removed her gag. Monsieur Poirot, she whispered hoarsely, I thought I would die. You are alive, Poirot said softly. Take comfort in that. He cut the ropes gently with a pocket tool, helping her sit up. Tears streamed down her cold, reddened cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't want to get involved. Poirot nodded. But you were involved, malgré vous, despite yourself. She clutched his sleeve. I saw who was near the conservatory. I saw... Poirot raised a finger. Not now. Save your strength. But she gripped him fiercely. No, you must know. It was... Her words were cut off by the sound of rushing footsteps. Vivienne, Madeleine, Lionel, and Thomas burst in, gasping at the sight of her. Poirot rose calmly. She lives. Someone intended her to be found only when it was too late. Lionel cursed under his breath. Who would do such a thing? Poirot's eyes flickered briefly toward him. Someone desperate, Poirot answered. Someone who fears the truth. When Miss Rowe was carried back to the manor, Poirot lingered in the boathouse doorway. The wind tore at his coat, but he did not move. He stared at the floor. At the faint impression in the dust, a shoe print, a very small, very distinct shoe print. Poirot knelt again, examining it closely. The heel shape, the narrow arch, the pointed toe, not a man's shoe, a woman's, and not Miss Rowe's. Poirot straightened, his face transformed, not with surprise, but with cold, silent confirmation. He murmured to himself, So, it is as I thought. Back inside, the household gathered in the drawing room around Miss Rowe, who lay on a sofa, wrapped in blankets and trembling. Poirot offered her warm tea and allowed her a moment to steady herself. Inspector Briggs arrived moments later, jacket dusted with snow. What the devil happened? He barked. Poirot explained with calm precision. Mademoiselle Rowe was taken to the boathouse. She was left bound, likely with the expectation that the cold would finish what the murderer dared not do openly. Briggs scowled. Do you know who did it? Poirot considered him carefully. I know enough. A collective breath caught. Poirot turned to Miss Rowe gently. Mademoiselle, when you are ready, tell us what you saw near the conservatory before Charles Mandeville died. Everyone leaned forward. Miss Rowe's voice was faint but clear. I saw someone wearing a dark coat. Standing near the conservatory door. They were watching the library windows. They looked as if they were planning something. Poirot nodded slowly. And the silhouette? It was small. Slight. Yes, she whispered. A woman. A wave of tension rippled through the room. Vivienne froze. Beatrice gasped. Madeleine's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas stared at the floor. Lionel didn't breathe. Edgar's eyes narrowed dangerously. Poirot lifted a hand. "We shall continue this conversation soon, but for now, let Mademoiselle Rowe rest." He ushered everyone out, closing the door behind them. Then he turned, looking down the corridor with a gaze sharp as ice. He whispered, "The circle tightens." Later that night, Poirot stood alone in the library, the glow of the fire illuminating his face. He spoke softly, not to the room, but to the shadows themselves. "There is one among you whose lies are woven too carefully, one whose fear betrays her, one whose silence speaks louder than words." He paused. "And tonight, I shall expose you." The snowstorm had reached its fiercest point when Hercule Poirot summoned everyone to the great hall. Candles flickered in every corner, casting tall, wavering shadows across the paneled walls. The Christmas tree stood glowing but strangely somber, its glittering ornaments coldly reflecting the tension that filled the room. Madeleine, trembling though composed, stood by Poirot's side. Inspector Briggs, red-faced and irritable, clutched his notebook as though it might steady him. The remaining guests assembled slowly, each wearing an expression that ranged from fear to fury. Poirot stepped forward. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice calm but carrying a gravity that drew all attention instantly. "The hour has come. We stand on the edge of truth. The lies have been spoken, the secrets hidden, and the shadows have danced long enough." Vivian Clark swallowed nervously. Edgar stood stiff as a pillar. Beatrice hunched beside him, wringing the edge of her sleeve. Julian Harwood stood pale, eyes darting. Captain Fair leaned against the mantel, jaw clenched. Thomas Reed stood near the back, hands trembling slightly. Poirot clasped his hands gently. "Tonight, I shall lay before you the true picture. But until the final moment," he tapped his temple, "these little gray cells must consider every detail. And you, mes amis, must listen." The room fell utterly silent. Poirot lifted the sealed evidence sleeve containing the note found beside Charles Mandeville. "First," he declared, "let us discuss the message. The answer lies with you." A dramatic statement, oui, but also misleading. A murmur ran across the room. Poirot continued. Charles Mandeville was a man of clarity, of precision. He wrote neatly, carefully, never in haste. This note, however, was written in a rushed, uneven hand. Julian frowned. "So Charles didn't write it?" Poirot raised a finger. "Ah, but he did, yet not this version." Vivienne gasped. "You mean—" Poirot nodded slowly. "The note was tampered with, rewritten." Beatrice trembled. But why? Poirot walked before them like a professor, revealing a grand theory. Because the original message, written on a blue Christmas invitation, contained something explosive, something the murderer could not allow the world to see. So they burned it. He held up the tiny blue fragment salvaged from the fireplace. "This piece does not come from the forged note handed to Madeleine. It comes from the original, and the murderer tried and failed to destroy all evidence of it." Inspector Briggs scratched his head. "But who forged it?" Poirot smiled. "Patience, Inspector. We are merely beginning." Poirot turned sharply toward Harwood. "Monsieur Harwood, you were to bring a new will for Monsieur Mandeville. A will that greatly favored Mademoiselle Madeleine and dramatically reduced Edgar's inheritance." Edgar's face reddened with fury. Harwood nodded shakily. "Yes, I swear it." Poirot stepped closer. "And yet, a bank statement linking unexplained withdrawals to you was conveniently planted in the desk, meant to cast suspicion upon you." Harwood's shoulders slumped. "I told you, I had nothing to do with it." Poirot nodded. "Indeed, because the dust in the drawer betrayed the deception. That envelope was placed there very recently. Not days ago, not even hours before the death, but after." A ripple of shock moved across the room. After? Lionel asked. After Charles died. Poirot turned to him with cool satisfaction. Yes, Captain. Someone planted it to make Harwood appear guilty. He let the words sink in. Someone who feared that Charles's new will would expose rotten deeds from years past. Edgar shifted uncomfortably. Beatrice looked down at her feet. Poirot continued. And someone who knew where Inspector Briggs would look first. Briggs sputtered indignantly. Now see here. Poirot cut him off gently. Now, monsieur, no shame, only observation. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. Next, the conservatory. His gaze swept across the room. One of you claimed to have been there during the crucial minutes before the death. And yet, Poirot drew a breath. There I found an earring. A single, mismatched earring. Vivienne stiffened visibly. Poirot continued with polite precision. Madame Clark, your earrings last night were pearls. This is not yours. Vivienne relaxed only slightly. He turned to Beatrice. Yours, madame, are emerald droplets, also not yours. Beatrice let out a shaky breath. Poirot continued, but the earring did not belong to a man, nor to Miss Rowe, nor to Madeleine. A cold hush fell. Lionel raised a brow. Then whose? Poirot smiled thinly. Someone who does not wish us to know she was near the conservatory at all. Edgar's mouth fell open. What are you implying? He snapped. Poirot ignored the outburst. Poirot resumed his lecture-like stride. And then we have the matter of Mademoiselle Rowe, a simple woman, honest, observant, and terribly frightened. Thomas Reed's face contorted with pain. Miss Rowe, Poirot said softly, saw someone lurking near the conservatory before Charles died. A woman, a small woman. He scanned the group slowly. The murderer realized this, and so Mademoiselle Rowe was taken, not to kill immediately, but to silence, to remove her knowledge until the perfect moment to strike again. Gasps spread through the room. Poirot raised his chin, but the murderer made a mistake. Miss Rowe's coat was left where it did not belong, a theatrical display meant to mislead us, and inside the boathouse, Poirot narrowed his eyes, was a shoe print, a woman's shoe print. He paused dramatically, very small, very distinctive. Vivienne clutched the arm of her chair. Beatrice held her breath. Madeleine stared wide-eyed. Poirot continued. Poirot moved toward the fireplace, the flickering light sharpening the angles of his face. We have a forged note, a planted envelope, a lying alibi, a missing earring, a tampered coat, a broken padlock, and a disappearing woman. He turned sharply. This is not a case of passion, nor of impulse. No, mes amis, this is a crime carefully planned. Poirot pointed at the Christmas tree. Charles Mandeville invited each of you here for a reason. He suspected someone of deceit, of long-hidden crime, of betrayal. Edgar flinched. Julian stiffened. Vivienne looked faint. Lionel's jaw clenched. Poirot's voice grew firm, and the murderer feared that Charles intended to reveal everything, that this Christmas Eve would be the last before the truth emerged. A shudder rippled through the room. Briggs blurted, well, who was Charles going to expose then? Poirot held up a hand. Patience, Inspector. Patience. He paced once more. I will tell you something now that will narrow our circle. Everyone leaned forward instinctively. Poirot spoke clearly, deliberately. The murderer is a woman. A collective gasp erupted. Vivienne staggered backward. Beatrice uttered a small cry. Madeleine froze completely. Even Briggs stared dumbfounded. Poirot waited for silence to return. And not only a woman, he added, but a woman who knew the will was changing, who had something to lose, who feared discovery by Miss Rowe, who left her earring behind, who forged the note, who planted the bank envelope. He paused. The truth, mes amis, is very close." Poirot stepped back, his eyes blazing. "And in the next room, I shall reveal it all." The household followed Poirot into the library, like figures compelled by fate. The snowstorm wailed against the windows, but inside the room, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock, each second falling like a heartbeat of destiny. Poirot stood before the fireplace where Charles Mandeville had taken his last breath. The flames cast a warm glow across his immaculate suit. Madeleine stood behind him, pale but resolute. Inspector Briggs hovered near the door, notebook ready, though his pen trembled. Poirot turned slowly. "Mesdames et messieurs, the truth is now clear." Attention stretched across the room like a drawn bow. Poirot continued, his voice smooth, precise. "Charles Mandeville did not die of natural causes. He died because someone wished to silence him before he revealed a long-hidden crime." He glanced toward Madeleine, whose eyes glistened. "And that crime," Poirot said softly, "was theft, betrayal, and attempted murder." Julian Harwood flinched, but "Who?" Poirot raised a hand. "You shall hear all. Let us begin with the forged message." Poirot held up the sleeve containing the cryptic note. "This message, 'The answer lies with you,' was not Charles' intended warning. His true note was written on a blue Christmas invitation, but someone destroyed it in the fireplace." He lifted the charred blue scrap, and in their haste they left behind this piece. The murderer forged a replacement to divert suspicion. Madeleine's voice trembled. "But why frame Julian?" Poirot turned to her gently. "To protect themselves, mademoiselle, and because Julian was the easiest target." Harwood swallowed. "But who forged it?" Poirot's eyes swept the room. "A woman. One familiar with Charles's handwriting, though unable to copy it perfectly." Vivienne looked horrified. Beatrice shook her head violently. Madeleine stepped back instinctively. Poirot continued. "Next," Poirot said, "we examined the conservatory." He revealed the earring he had found beneath the glass table, the small, elegant jewel with a distinctive silver lattice. "This earring does not belong to Vivienne, nor to Beatrice, nor to Madeleine, nor to Miss Rowe." Poirot paused. "It belongs to someone with access to fine jewelry, but not the means to afford it." He turned sharply. "It belongs to you, madame." Vivienne Clark gasped aloud. Poirot lifted a hand. "Not Vivienne Clark. She wears only pearls." Slowly, Poirot turned toward the trembling woman seated near Edgar. Beatrice Mandeville froze. The room erupted in whisper-shocked disbelief. Poirot nodded once. "Yes, Beatrice." Edgar's face twisted. "Beatrice? My Beatrice? That cannot be—" Poirot raised his voice. "Silence, if you please." Poirot stepped closer to Beatrice. "You, madame, feared exposure more than anyone, because unlike your husband, who has long been suspected of financial misconduct, you were the true culprit behind the thefts from the Mandeville accounts." Beatrice's lips parted in a tiny, strangled sound. Poirot continued, relentless. "You forged Edgar's signature. You took funds for years. Charles discovered irregularities and called Edgar here to confront him, wrongly believing Edgar guilty." Beatrice shook her head frantically. No. Poirot softened his tone slightly. "Your husband has many flaws, madame, but he did not commit the theft. You did." Edgar collapsed into a chair, stunned. Poirot continued. "You knew Charles intended to sign the new will that night, a will that would give Madeleine the estate and empower her to investigate the accounts." Madeleine gasped. "You realized that once she did so, your theft would be revealed." Beatrice sobbed quietly, crumpling inward like a paper flower in rain. Poirot pressed onward. "At 9:08 p.m., you slipped from your husband's side while he raged through the corridor. You entered the conservatory and waited, crouched, for Charles to pass from the library to the dining room." Poirot pointed sharply. "You attacked him not with a weapon, but with poison." The room reeled. Lionel frowned. Poison? But there were no signs. Poirot cut him off. No signs to the untrained eye. But Charles had tea always at that hour. You lace the teapot with digitalis, easily accessible from the garden shed's medicinal supplies. The symptoms appear as sudden heart failure. Poirot tapped his chest. Confusion, collapse, disorientation. Madeleine covered her mouth in horror. Poirot said gently, "Your uncle did not fall by accident. He collapsed because his heart had ceased to beat regularly." He turned back to Beatrice, and when he realized what had happened, he tried to warn us with a final note, scribbled onto the nearest paper he could find. His Christmas invitations. Poirot's voice darkened, but you grabbed it from his half-limp hand, tore it apart, and burned it. Beatrice was sobbing openly now, head bowed low. Poirot continued mercilessly. You then forged a replacement note to misdirect suspicion onto another, and later you planted the bank envelope to incriminate Julian. "Stop," Beatrice whispered. "Please, stop." Poirot's eyes softened slightly. "There is more. When Miss Rose saw you lurking by the conservatory doors, you feared she had witnessed too much. So later in the night, when the storm grew, you lured her out the back door, struck her, and dragged her toward the hedges." Gasps filled the room. "You left her coat in the snow to suggest a tragic fate. Then you hid her in the boathouse, hoping the cold would finish what you dared not." Beatrice shook uncontrollably. Poirot leaned in. "But you forgot one detail. Your shoe print, a shoe print unique to your narrow-heeled evening boots." He held up a thin piece of snow-dusted leather, a heel protector found near the boathouse door. Beatrice stared at it in mute horror. Poirot whispered, "La vérité." Beatrice collapsed forward, wailing. "I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted to scare him, delay the will, stop him from exposing me. Edgar would have left me if he knew. He would have hated me." Edgar stared at her, tears glazing his eyes. Poirot bowed his head slightly. "Murder, madame, is never an accident. It is a choice, one born from fear, yes, but a choice nonetheless." Inspector Briggs stepped forward. "Beatrice Mandeville, you're under arrest." Poirot raised a hand gently. "Let her finish." Beatrice sobbed. "I never meant to hurt Edith. Never. I only wanted to frighten her. But she screamed. I panicked. I bound her, left her." Poirot nodded sadly. "And so your choices led to ruin." Beatrice collapsed entirely as Briggs took hold of her. Edgar stood like a shattered statue. Madeleine wept quietly into a handkerchief. Miss Rowe, from the doorway, whispered a faint prayer of relief. Poirot watched silently as Beatrice was led away. Then he approached Madeleine, placing a gentle hand upon hers. "Your uncle loved you dearly, mademoiselle. Remember this. His last act was to protect you and to expose a hidden truth." Madeleine nodded, tears falling freely. "And now," Poirot said softly, "my work is done." Lionel asked quietly, "How do you bear it, Poirot? Seeing the worst in humanity?" Poirot gave a small, melancholic smile. "Ah, Captain, I see the worst, yes, but also the best. In courage, in loyalty, in love." He touched his temple. "It is the balance that keeps Poirot steady." He reached for his hat and coat. "Now, mes amis, I take my leave. Christmas awaits, and though it comes wrapped in sorrow, it comes nonetheless." Poirot stepped into the snowy night, lantern light spilling out behind him like a halo. The storm had begun to pass, and justice, once more, had found its way through the darkness,